Boldwood presents A Fresh Start at the Cornish Country Hospital, written by Joe Bartlett and read by Emma Powell. Prologue. Eve massaged her temples with small circular movements, trying to stave off the headache that had been threatening for the last hour. Paracetamol wouldn't cut it. She needed sleep. It had been a long shift, and this was the first chance she'd had to catch her breath and stop in the last 3 hours. All she wanted to do was to go home, get into her nice warm bed, sink into the memory foam mattress, and rest her head against Max's shoulder. Except that wasn't going to be an option. "You look like I feel, Evie B. Absolutely bloody knackered." Vic Stanhope, the lead nurse in A&E, always said it like it was, in a broad Leeds accent and with a smile that very rarely slipped off her face, no matter how tough a shift they were having. "We've got half an hour left, and then you can get yourself off home." "I wish I could, but I've got to pick Max up from his stag do." Eve rolled her eyes, but even that was painful. "Let him get a cab, the silly sod. What is this anyway, his 14th stag do?" "Third. I realise it seems ridiculous, but you know Max. He's got so many friends and he makes more wherever he goes. He'd have needed to hire Ellen Road to catch up with all of his mates in one go." It was an exaggeration, of course, to claim that Max could have filled Leeds United's football stadium with his friends, but there were a lot of them, and they came from all walks of life, spanning 2 or 3 generations, the different hospitals he'd worked in, and a wide range of interests. Tonight's third and final stag do, at least that's what Eve hoped it would be, was with a group of guys all more or less the same age as Max, and it was an old-school kind of night out. There'd have been plenty of drinking, a bit of dancing at one of the clubs once their inhibitions had been loosened, and right about now they'd probably be queuing for a kebab somewhere, refuelling before they went on to the next club. It was a stark contrast to his second stag do, which had involved watching Formula One racing in Monaco with a group of friends and relatives who had more money than sense in Eve's opinion. Some of the friends stretched right back to Max's days at a prestigious private school in Berkshire, 4 counties away from his family home in Cornwall. But he got on with everybody, and he didn't care what their background was. If Max liked you, then you made a friend for life, and everybody loved him. There'd been times when Eve had felt a bit resentful. Everybody wanted a piece of Max, and it ate into their time together. They'd met on their first day at medical school, and the magnetism that drew everyone to him had also worked its spell on Eve. She hadn't thought for a moment that her feelings for him would be reciprocated, but he'd made it clear almost straight away that they were, and they'd been together ever since. It was perfect. They shared so many of the same goals and values, and his family had welcomed her with open arms, something she valued more than she could have put into words. She'd lost her mother to cancer when she was just 14, and had moved in with her father, a more than slightly resentful stepmother whose plans to move to Spain had been scuppered by Eve's arrival. As soon as she'd started university, the plans were back on, and her father and stepmother now lived in southern Spain, running a bar and raising their beautiful twin sons, who probably thought of Eve as more of a distant cousin than a sister. Max's family, by contrast, had folded her into the centre of their lives and had made her feel welcome from the very first time he'd taken her home with him. She adored them, and it was just one more reason she felt incredibly lucky to be marrying Max and taking another step towards the life they wanted. Their careers were going just the way they'd wanted too. Eve had specialised in emergency medicine, having found her passion early on in the foundation stage of her training. And Max was 2/3 of the way through his training to become a surgeon. They'd both worked at St James's Hospital, but for the second phase of his training, he'd moved to the nearby Leeds Children's Hospital to specialise in paediatrics. They were the type of couple who had 5, 10, and even 20-year plans, because Eve needed the security of being able to picture their future. Her mother's diagnosis and subsequent death had made it feel as if the world had been ripped out from under her feet. Max brought the spontaneity and the fun, thinking nothing of booking them a holiday based on the toss of a coin, or something as simple as turning off the road when they travelled down to Cornwall to check out a town or village he'd never been to before, just because he liked the sound of the name on the road sign. She knew without a shadow of a doubt that he was the person she was supposed to share her life with. And she wouldn't have minded if he wanted 33 stag do's and she had to pick him up from every single one of them at the end of a long shift, as long as he felt the same way about her. And she knew he did. Oh yeah, know what Max is like, all right, and to be honest, if he'd let me come, I'd have tagged along on one of his stag do's instead of coming to your hen. Vic gave a throaty laugh, throwing back her head and making the wooden beads at the end of her long braided hair knock together like wind chimes. Oh, thanks a lot. Despite her words, Eve was already laughing. You know, I'm only joking, chick. I wouldn't have missed that for the world. Vic gave her shoulders a squeeze. And I still think there's time for us to cram another one in. Maybe even 2. You can't let Max have all the fun, and it's still nearly 3 weeks until the wedding. 1 was enough for me, and I've discovered that shift work and hangovers do not mix. It will probably take me the full 3 weeks to get over it, especially if you're in charge of the drinking games again. It had been a brilliant weekend, hiring an Airbnb in the Peak District, which was a more or less halfway point between her life in Leeds and Max's family in Cornwall. His mother, sister and aunt had all joined Eve and her friends for the celebration, and there was no way it could be topped. All the women who meant the most to her were there, and she felt absolutely no need to repeat it. Spot. Vic laughed again. Still, I could always pretend I'm on a stag do, the amount of drunks we get here on a Friday night, although the usually endless stream does seem to have dried up in the last half an hour. Vic, don't. That's almost as bad as saying that it's, well, you know, the word we never ever say. Eve widened her eyes in mock horror. They both knew better than to ever say it was quiet, because then the floodgates were guaranteed to open and then be back to being run off their feet for the rest of the shift. I'm not that daft. As soon as I open my mouth, it'd be... She didn't even get a chance to finish the sentence before the red phone behind them started to ring. It meant a patient with a serious trauma was on the way in. Turning like a ballerina performing a flawless pirouette, Vic snatched up the phone, taking down the details of the call from the paramedics before relaying them to the rest of the team. Male, early 30s with a serious head injury resulting from an assault and subsequent blow to the head from hitting the pavement. The paramedics suspect a skull fracture and possible serious frontal lobe bleed. He has a GCS score of 4, estimated time of arrival, 5 minutes. Oh God, that doesn't sound good. Eve hated these kinds of calls. Someone so young whose life was now hanging in the balance. A life which would almost certainly be irrevocably changed even if he did survive. She couldn't allow herself to think too much about the tragedies she'd encountered every single day at work. They had a job to do. Right, let's get ready. Within minutes, Eve was standing by the doors to the emergency department with Vic by her side. She hadn't even realised it had been raining until now. Despite the fact that the sky was jet black, it was still humid outside. Summer in the city at its peak, and steam rose off the ground as the rain hit the warm tarmac. The wail of the siren heralded the approach of the ambulance, and the reflection of the flashing blue lights bounced off the wet road. This was their patient. She recognised Ali, the paramedic who was driving, who both she and Max had known since their early days at the hospital. Ali leapt out of the front of the ambulance, heading straight round to the back to open the doors. But then, as Eve and Vic moved towards the back of the ambulance too, Ali turned, her face draining of colour and looking deathly white in the eerie light. Eve, I don't know. Ali shook her head and turned to look at Vic. She shouldn't be here, not for this. What do you mean I shouldn't be here? Even as she said the words, Eve knew what they meant, but she couldn't acknowledge them, because she couldn't allow it to be true. Then any last semblance of hope she had that she might have misunderstood was taken from her. The world as she knew it was being ripped away for the second time in her life, as Ali mumbled the words she so desperately didn't want her to say. It's Max. Chapter 1. 2 years later. Eve woke with a start, all 4 of her limbs flinching violently, almost as if she'd been electrocuted. She'd been back in that room again, standing by the side of Max's bed as one of her colleagues delivered the devastating news about his test results. The bleed in Max's brain has caused irrevocable damage. It's going to be life-changing for both of you. It was a moment she never wanted to relive, but every time she closed her eyes, she knew there was a good chance of that happening. Even when she didn't close her eyes, it could happen. Working in an emergency department, there were far too many triggers and reminders of that terrible night, meaning the possibility of being forced to relive it was always present. All it took was for another patient to be rushed in whose circumstances or injuries were an echo of Max's, or a relative who was forced to hear the same fateful words and be told that their loved one would never be the same again. The cases that Eve found especially hard were the ones that came out of nowhere, where the patient and their family had just been getting on with their lives, not expecting anything out of the ordinary to happen, and then, bam, out of the blue, they'd been hit by a sucker punch that changed everything. That's what had happened to Max, in every sense. A complete idiot, who Max and his friends had walked past on their night out, had for some unknown reason taken offence to the group of 30-somethings laughing and having fun. Brandon Moorcroft was the name of the man who changed everything with a single punch directed to the back of Max's head, sending him sprawling forward, making him lose his footing and smack his head against the pavement. Moorcroft had been half out of his mind on a combination of drugs and alcohol, having got wasted after splitting up with his partner. He hadn't been able to justify to the police why he'd attacked Max, except for the fact that he was wearing a t-shirt clearly marking him out as the Stag. Moorcroft claimed that white-hot rage had washed over him because Max was getting married and he'd just been dumped. The attack was completely unprovoked, and Moorcroft had eventually sobbed in court, saying how desperately he wished he could take it back. But there was no rewind button. That decision, that single blow to the back of Max's head, had ruined so many lives, and Eve wasn't sure she'd ever be able to shut her eyes and know for certain that she wouldn't be back in that moment, one she'd have given anything not to have happened. Less than half an hour after waking up, Eve was on her way to work. She ran to St. Piran's whenever the timing of her shifts allowed. There were staff changing rooms, lockers, and a couple of showers available. It meant she could try and run off some of the tension in her body before she started her day and change into her uniform once she was ready. The rucksack on her back contained everything else she needed, and the meandering route she took to work allowed her to take in some of the scenery that made Cornwall so beautiful. She lived on the top floor of a converted former grain store with far-reaching views of the countryside, but too far from the coast to get even a glimpse of the sea. If she'd run directly to the hospital via the quickest route, it would have been less than 1.5 miles. As it was, she always took a route of at least 3 miles, sometimes more than double that, depending on how much time she had to spare. She loved the rough terrain of the coastal path, not just for the beautiful views of aquamarine water and the dramatic cliffs jutting out of the waves, but because it required concentration to avoid tripping or falling. It meant her mind was less busy with all of the other things that usually dominated her thoughts, the worries and the fears, and sometimes even the regret. Not tripping and falling to her death while running on the coastal path was a form of mindfulness that Eve was pretty sure she'd invented. Maybe she should market it to others, because sometimes it felt like it was the only thing keeping her sane. "Did you run here again?" Meg, one of the other A&E doctors, widened her eyes when Eve nodded as she emerged from the changing room after showering and drying her hair. "My God, you put us all to shame." "Not me." Eden, a staff nurse in the emergency department, gave them a rueful grin. "I've a 4-year-old with autism to get ready and out of the door to nursery before I get to work, so I've already had my workout for the day." "Fair point, and trust me, I fully intend to recoup the calories on my first break." Eve tapped the side of her nose. "Rumour has it that Gwen is bringing in one of her famous cakes to celebrate the fact that she's got another grandchild on the way." Eve turned her palms towards the ceiling, indicating the futility of trying to resist the offer of cake. Gwen was the volunteer coordinator who ran the Friends of St. Piran's hospital shop and was like a stand-in mother come agony aunt to all of the staff, and people rarely turned down any offer she might make. Has she? That's great news. Aidan, the most senior nurse on duty, beamed before lowering his voice and exchanging a glance with Eve. Though I'm really glad Esther isn't in today. If she hears one more bit of baby news, I think it might break her. I think you might be right. Eve sighed, thinking about Esther's reaction to one of their recent admissions, a young girl who'd taken 2 entire packets of birth control pills in a misguided and extremely dangerous attempt to end an unwanted pregnancy. Esther, who was the department's lead nurse, had gone about her duties as diligently as ever, caring for the young girl and staying by her side when her stomach was pumped, monitoring her condition in the hours that followed while they waited for space on a ward, and even supporting her when she spoke to her parents. Afterwards, though, when the girl had been taken up to the ward, Esther had broken down at the injustice of it all. She'd been trying for a baby with her husband, Joe, for over a year, she'd said. Her own birth control pills having been consigned to the bin and replaced with multivitamins, folic acid, and even a supplement that claimed to be a birth control detox. None of them had made any difference so far, and she and Joe, a consultant psychiatrist at the hospital, had just been referred for fertility treatment. Sorry, my hormones are haywire. Esther had taken a shuddering breath as Eve had passed her a tissue, and Aidan had wrapped his arms around her shoulders, offering the hug she clearly so badly needed. Eve had been grateful he was there, because as much as she'd wanted to hug Esther, somehow she couldn't bring herself to do it. She'd been in the hospital for well over a year now, and she was gradually getting to know them all better. But a stretch of personal leave in the middle of that had meant she still felt like the new girl in lots of ways, even though Meg and Eden had both joined after her. She was probably closest to the 2 of them, and had been out for drinks with the entire team a couple of times, but none of them knew the full story about why she'd left Leeds and ended up in Cornwall. In fact, they barely knew anything about her personal life at all. She kept herself so closed up these days that she hadn't wanted to open the floodgates of her own emotions by letting herself connect too closely with any grief her colleague was feeling. All those unfulfilled plans, all the hopes and dreams that might never be realized had felt too close to home, even if their circumstances were completely different. Instead, Eve had offered to make tea. She could cope with that, and had lost count of the number of times it had been offered to her in the wake of Max's accident. Before the night of his 3rd stag do, she'd believed that Yorkshire tea, the signature drink of her adopted county, really could work miracles. But she'd found out the hard way that sometimes the best it could do was to provide a brief distraction, or reason for someone who had no idea how to offer meaningful comfort to take a break from trying to, just for a little while. I guess we'd better start this shift then. Eve tightened the hairband that was tying back her long, dark brown ponytail. She'd grown her hair for the wedding, having chosen a half-up, half-down sort of beachy boho look that had felt perfectly in keeping with the venue, just 10 miles from the hospital where she now stood. The hairdresser had never arrived to style her hair. Her dress still hung in a wardrobe at Max's parents' house, unworn. And all the plans they'd made for their wedding had come to nothing in the end. Yet somehow she couldn't bring herself to cut her hair, despite the fact that it would be so much more practical. Oh God, sorry to do this to you at handover. Isla, one of the other nurses on the team, pushed open the door to the staff room, cutting off any response that Eve's colleagues might have been about to make. But we've just had a call on the red phone. A tourist in a hire car lost control coming down the hill into the harbour in Port Agnes and ended up pinning 2 pedestrians against the wall and hitting another. ETA is 10 minutes. Here we go again. Meg grimaced as they all moved to follow Isla, and all Eve could do was nod mutely. Here they went again, indeed, facing another incident when someone's life might have been changed forever, even destroyed. It never got any easier facing up to these moments, but Eve had to do it if she was going to be able to carry on doing her job. And sometimes, just lately, it felt as if being a doctor in A&E was the only part of her old self that Eve had left. Oakwood Park, as the name suggested, was a 12-acre site dominated by the mature oak trees dotted around the grounds and the beautiful Victorian former manor house, which now housed a charitable foundation providing 24-hour nursing, neuro-rehabilitation, educational services, respite, and supported living accommodation for people with a range of head injuries, from those needing minor care to maintain their independence to those with complex disabilities. It had been Max's home since his discharge from hospital 14 months ago, and it was somewhere Eve felt she could have negotiated the journey to with her eyes shut. It had been too late to visit Max the day before, after a shift that had started with 3 badly injured pedestrians and a driver who, it turned out, hadn't simply lost control of his car, but had suffered a heart attack at the wheel. That had set the tone for the day, and the shift had been non-stop. Eve had ended up staying on later than planned because of the backlog of patients still waiting when the night shift team had arrived, already short-staffed due to a sickness bug that was going around. She hadn't admitted, even to herself, that the idea of staying on at work was preferable to heading home and then driving over to see Max. Just the thought made her feel horribly guilty. But his mood seemed to have darkened over the past couple of weeks, and Eve increasingly felt like she'd become his whipping boy of choice. Today there was no option to stay on late, and she couldn't come up with a justifiable excuse to Max's mother because she was off work and Annie knew it. Annabelle, or Annie as she was known to her nearest and dearest, had begun asking Eve for copies of her work schedule as soon as she'd started at St. Piran's, and now it was a habit it seemed impossible to break, no matter how much she might want to. "Oh, Eve, thank goodness." Annie folded her into a highly perfumed hug the moment she entered the lounge that Max shared with 3 other residents. They all had their own bedrooms, but this communal area was viewed as a stepping stone to Max being able to move to one of the supported living bungalows in the grounds of Oakwood Park. "We were beginning to wonder if you decided not to come again." Annie's voice was falsely bright, so the tone didn't sound accusatory, even if the words were. Part of Eve wanted to tell her not-quite mother-in-law that it wasn't an option she could choose, because no one could withstand the guilt trip that decision would result in. Instead, she painted on a smile and swallowed back the words that were trying to escape. Coming to see Max was hard, because he still looked a lot like her Max, the man she had loved with every fibre of her being. But it wasn't her Max. He died on the night of his 3rd stag do, and no amount of rehabilitation or outright denial on his mother's part was ever going to bring him back. She almost wished he'd changed as much physically as he had in personality. Then maybe it would be easier to accept this new person. But she wasn't sure that would have made any real difference, because a lot of the time Max seemed to resent Eve's very existence. It was almost as if she was the reason he'd ended up at Oakwood Park, and in a way she supposed that was true. If they'd never met and fallen in love, he wouldn't have proposed, and he wouldn't have been out on that stag night, on the very evening that Brandon Moorcroft was. If Max had made one different decision anywhere along the line, he wouldn't have been in that precise place at that precise time, connecting with the blow that had floored him and ended all the plans they had for the future. Then there was the fact that she had been the one to help his mother choose Oakwood Park. "He'll need to be near to us and close to a hospital, not just for his treatment, but for when you relocate for work." Annie had made it sound like a fait accompli, and the truth was it had been. The relocation had never been in question as far as Max's mother was concerned. Eve had wanted to follow Max, of course she had, but her medical training meant she couldn't wear the same blinkers as his mother, burying her head in the sand and pretending that one day soon they'd get the old Max back. She knew that he was gone for good, and that the changes to his personality that had turned him into an entirely different person would not be reversed. She'd already lost the person she loved most in the world, and relocating to Cornwall meant leaving behind her closest friends. Oakwood Park was less than 10 minutes' drive from his parents' house in Carrick Water, a tiny hamlet between Port Agnes and Port Cara. It meant that Eve could also visit every day after work if she wanted to. Those last 4 words were loaded. If she'd admitted to anyone else, even herself, that she didn't always want to, she would have sounded like the worst person in the world. She knew that because she already felt like the worst person in the world. If Max had still been her Max and as happy to see her as he used to be, of course she'd have wanted to go every single day. But when someone made you feel about as welcome as a case of athlete's foot, it was much harder to feel inclined to visit at the end of a long day. "Have you heard anything from Lily?" Annie fired the question at Eve after she kissed her on both cheeks in a way that sometimes felt more like aggression than affection. It wasn't because Annie didn't love Eve. She knew Max's mother adored her. It was because ever since the assault, Annie had been in a state of high alert that made it slightly unnerving and very far from relaxing to be around her. She sent me a few photos and I've seen some updates on her Instagram stories. But if you're asking me whether she's mentioned anything about coming home, then no, she hasn't. Eve gave Annie a sympathetic smile. She knew how desperately Max's mother wanted her daughter Lily to come home from California. She also knew why Lily didn't want to, but that wasn't something she was willing to share with Annie. She was already hanging by a thread, and Eve wasn't going to be the one to cut it. Annie's behaviour and the expectation she'd put on her daughter in the wake of Max's assault had pushed Lily to a point where she'd admitted to Eve that she wasn't sure she wanted to go on. She'd been exhausted physically and mentally trying to live up to her mother's demands, and by the time Max was moved to Oakwood Park, she was already at breaking point. When her American boyfriend, Scott, had been offered a job back home and had asked Lily to go with him, it had been the life raft she'd needed. Annie hadn't taken it well at all, and it had led to her own mental health spiralling even further, which, in turn, had necessitated Eve taking time off work. Now that Annie was finally back to just about holding it all together, Eve wasn't about to shatter her hopes by telling her she wasn't sure Lily would ever come home. "She FaceTimes me on a Sunday, but the rest of the time it's just WhatsApps because of the time difference." Annie's mouth was downturned to the corners, but then it veered between that and the false brightness far too much these days. It was just one more thing that broke Eve's heart, because Annie had been the definition of joie de vivre before all of this. She could create a party out of nowhere, and her infectious laughter had rung around the Pascoe family home. Having more or less retired from Carew's, her maternal family's law firm, in the wake of Max's assault, Annie now had 3 obsessions: bringing about her son's complete recovery, getting Brandon Moorcroft's case reviewed to ensure he was assigned with a sentence she considered just, and persuading her daughter to move back home. Only the last of those had a possibility of happening, and based on the messages Eve had received from Lily, even that was very remote. Brandon Moorcroft had been sentenced to 3 years. Eve had to agree with Annie and Max's father, Nigel, that it wasn't nearly long enough. But Brandon had been high on methamphetamine after the breakdown of his relationship, and seemingly not just repentant, but distraught at the damage he had caused. His barrister had offered up a defence centering around his difficult childhood as mitigation for his behaviour, and his former partner as the one solid presence in his life. When she'd left, he'd unravelled, and Max had just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. It couldn't excuse what Moorcroft had done, but it did impact on the sentencing, and they'd all been distraught when his prison term was handed out. In the early days, it had felt as if the injustice of it all would eat Eve alive, and she could see it doing the same thing to Annie. For Eve, the turning point had come in learning more about Brandon Moorcroft's background and the counselling she'd undertaken in the months following his sentencing. Her therapist had told her that holding on to the anger would harm her more than it would ever hurt Moorcroft, and she'd known from how twisted up she felt inside that he was right. She'd needed to find a way to let go of the sense of making things right by punishing Brandon Moorcroft, because no sentence would ever be enough. Her therapist had suggested that she look into restorative justice, which would give her the opportunity to sit across the table from Brandon, if he agreed to be part of it, and talk to him about the impact his actions had had on her life, and try to understand how he could have got to the point he'd reached on that fateful night. Eve had felt more and more lately that it was something she wanted to do, and she wanted to suggest it to Annie, to stop the bitterness from continuing to eat Max's mother from the inside out. But that was something Annie was nowhere near ready to hear, and Eve had a feeling she never would be. I'm sure Lily will come home for a visit soon. Eve squeezed Annie's hand, hoping her words would offer some reassurance, despite the fact she knew they were a lie. Thank goodness I've got my bonus daughter. Max's mother gave her a wobbly smile, and Eve forced herself to return it. She loved Annie and Nigel as if they really were her parents, but they didn't know what was in her heart, and she was terrified that if they ever found out, they wouldn't just stop loving her, they'd never want to see her again. Where's Max? He's with the occupational therapist. They're working on the targets they've set him to achieve before he'll be allowed to move into one of the bungalows, but he should be back any minute. Annie smiled again, and Eve nodded. There were 5 shared bungalows for semi-independent living on the Oakwood Park estate, where the residents could move to as a step towards possibly moving into supported lodgings in the community, and sometimes even to full independence at some point in the future. The thought of that outcome made Eve shiver. What would everyone expect of her if Max was allowed to leave Oakwood Park? Whatever it was, she had a feeling she was destined to fall short. How's he getting on with... Oh, here he is. Talk of the devil. Annie cut Eve off, clapping her hands in delight as Max came back into the room. Not the devil, you silly old woman. It was a term Max had teased his mother with in the past, but back then it had come with so much love and affection, off the back of her struggling to download a new app on her phone or losing her glasses when they were perched on the top of her head. Now it sounded like he meant it. I was just teasing, sweetheart. Annie hugged him tightly. If his words cut her, she wasn't showing it. Look who's here, darling. It's Eve. Hi. Max sounded like a truculent teen, and as Eve took a step closer, he wrinkled his nose. You stink. Don't be silly, of course she doesn't. The laugh that accompanied Annie's words sounded forced, and Max clearly wasn't going to be put off his stride. Yes, she does. She stinks. I've come straight from work. It's probably the smell of the hospital. Eve forced another smile, trying to remind herself just how triggering those kinds of smells must be for Max. She'd changed her clothes, but maybe the smell of antiseptic was clinging to her skin and her hair. He'd spent far too long in hospital in the weeks after the assault, and then there was the fact that the person he'd been, the trainee surgeon who'd lived for his career, would never go back to a hospital in that capacity again. No wonder he resented any reminder. Well, I don't want to smell it. Max folded his arms across his chest, suddenly going from sounding like a stroppy teenager to looking like a toddler. Let's go outside, shall we? Spring is definitely on the way and it's lovely out there. Annie was doing her best to smooth over the situation, as she always did, desperately trying to pretend everything would all be okay if they could just get through all of this. She seemed determined not to accept that all of this was the new normal and there was no getting through it, at least not to the place where they'd come from. Okay, but the wind better not blow the smell in my direction. Max stalked out of the door before either of them could answer, and as Eve exchanged a look with his mother, Annie just shrugged. Just give it a bit more time, she said, the way she had so often before, and Eve wanted to ask how much time would be enough for her to give, because she knew forever wouldn't be long enough, and just lately even one more day felt like more than she could bear. Chapter 2. Felix closed the door behind him and let out a long breath. He'd known how lucky he was to find this place, one of 6 purpose-built apartments, or flats, as his sister insisted on calling them, teasing him as she always did for becoming so Americanized during his time in San Francisco. Whatever Eden wanted to call it, his new home was just what he'd hoped for when moving back to the UK. The big windows meant that it was full of light, even on the dullest of days, and Felix had a good-sized balcony with a view of the sea. There was even a shared garden, which had a gate on one side leading to a footpath that went all the way to the beach. He'd wanted a dog for as long as he could remember, but his apartment in San Francisco hadn't been pet-friendly in the slightest. And then there'd been Meredith. He'd wondered for a while if getting a dog might help, give her something to focus on other than the demons that had so often felt as if they were on the verge of overwhelming her. The way things had become in the end, he couldn't have trusted her to look after herself, let alone a dog. She might even have sold it when he was at work one day. Anything was possible when she needed to score her next hit. Now he could get a dog if he wanted one, and come home from work knowing that it had been looked after by whatever doggy daycare service he booked it into. There were no more calls from Meredith at all hours of the day and night, telling him she was in trouble and needed his help. The only person he had to look after was himself, and it was a huge relief not to be responsible for anyone or anything else. It was weird, though, the way the human psyche worked, because he also felt strangely bereft, as though something was missing. He didn't want to go back to that life, but the void that trying to help Meredith had left behind was what had left him to volunteer for Doma Samer, a local charity. It had been set up initially to try to combat homelessness, but now the charity also supported addicts, recovering addicts, and victims of domestic abuse. His first day volunteering there had taken him back to some of his darkest days in San Francisco, trying to help fentanyl addicts, most of whom had long ago lost the desire to try and help themselves. A colleague at the hospital where he'd worked in San Francisco had asked if he would help out, and as an occupational therapist, he truly believed he had some skills that could be useful to people whose long-term use of the drug had resulted in a huge physical toll on their bodies as well as their minds. The clinic Felix volunteered at, By the Bay Recovery, was where he'd met Meredith. A former addict herself, but 5 years clean, she'd retrained as a therapist to help others as a way of giving back to those who had saved her. It had been incredibly easy to fall in love with her, and he'd barely given her past a thought when their relationship had moved from friendship to something he'd hope would last forever. Felix had always known that alcoholics and drug addicts were in recovery for life, but at first he'd felt sure that Meredith had banished her demons. He could never have guessed the day he met her, or in the months that followed as their relationship deepened, that she was constantly teetering frighteningly close to a relapse. Meredith seemed to have it all together, and she ran 5 miles every day, saying it kept her mind and body in the kind of condition she owed them after all the abuse she'd put them through. It wasn't just a routine, it was essential to her well-being, and looking back, maybe that had also been an addiction of sorts. Felix just didn't realize because all he could see was the woman he loved. He'd felt guilty ever since for not seeing the signs in her when he should have been able to. Growing up with an alcoholic mother who hadn't managed to break the cycle until he was an adult, Felix knew that sobriety often balanced on a knife edge. His mother had tried numerous times in the past and had fallen off the wagon, and even when she did manage to quit drinking, there was always a fear in the back of his mind that at any moment she could start again. All of that made it even harder to forgive himself for not truly considering that possibility when it came to the woman he'd shared his life and home with. Meredith was almost the quintessential Californian girl when it came to her appearance. Long blonde hair, bluey grey eyes that looked like they'd been colour-matched to the water in San Francisco Bay, and a broad, bright smile that made it look for all the world as though she'd never encountered a major problem in her life. And the truth was, by some standards, she hadn't. Instead, Meredith had a predisposition to poor mental health, where even minor knocks and blows could feel catastrophic and leave her desperate to numb her resulting anxiety. It had started off with alcohol when she was still at school, and progressed through an addiction to prescription painkillers after a minor accident, and eventually onto Class A drugs, until she was no longer functioning at all. That seemed to be far behind her by the time they met. But then she'd lost a client she'd grown close to, and all the years of therapy and studying and helping others overcome their demons just melted away. Meredith had spiraled back into addiction in a way that had been terrifyingly quick, and nothing that Felix had tried had been able to pull her out again. She'd left the home they shared, telling him he didn't understand her and that he never would because he hadn't had to fight his own addiction. He'd been desperate to get Meredith the support she needed to get well again. At first, she'd rung him at all hours of the day and night asking for help, mainly in the form of money she claimed she needed for food. But they both knew she didn't care whether she ate or not. All she cared about was her next hit. Then she disappeared altogether. Someone had told Felix they'd heard she'd gone back into rehab, but she'd stopped calling him, or even picking up when he tried to get hold of her, and he discovered that she'd racked up thousands of dollars worth of debt on credit cards she'd taken out in his name. Felix had done everything he could to track her down, working with her family to try and save the woman they all loved, and in the end, it had pushed him to the edge of his own limits, and he'd been forced to make the decision to leave San Francisco, to give himself some peace of mind. His friend, Carl, still worked at the clinic, and Felix had asked him to keep trying to find Meredith and to let him know if she turned up, because if there was anything he could do to help her, he wouldn't hesitate. The love he'd felt for Meredith was still there, but it had morphed from romantic love to a kind of compassionate sorrow. He really hoped she was getting the help she needed and that this time it might actually work. But coming home to Cornwall had saved him from living half a life, constantly on edge. He'd taken a job as an occupational therapist at St. Piran's hospital. It was a world away from his life in California, and even though addiction problems existed everywhere, the rugged beauty of the coastline in the area where he'd grown up had soothed his soul from the moment he got back. Most of his patients were rehabilitating from injuries or strokes, and he felt as though he could really help them make meaningful steps towards recovery, or at least find new ways to function that would improve their quality of life. Yet, as the weeks ticked by, the void had opened up inside him, and the desire to do more to help people like Meredith had grown with it. She haunted his dreams, and when Drew, his sister's boyfriend, had told him about his own volunteering at Domasamer, it had felt like the outlet he needed. That had proved to be true, but he'd almost forgotten there'd be days like this. Days when it hit home that sometimes there was nothing that could be done to change the outcome everyone was working so desperately hard to try and avoid. Days when he'd be reminded so sharply of Meredith that it would feel almost impossible to breathe. Knock, 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 knock. It was almost like Morse code, the way his sister knocked on the door, announcing who it was without her having to say a word. It was a code they'd come up with as kids, when their rooms had been their sanctuaries and they didn't want to let anyone in except one another. Their mother had been in the grip of alcoholism back then, but their father had made his own mistakes, enabling his wife and trying to cover up what was going on. Even when Felix had told his dad that he and Eden felt unsafe when their mother was on one of her drunken rampages, he hadn't forced her to get help. Instead of making his wife face the consequences of her actions, he'd fitted locks to both of his children's bedroom doors so that they could feel safe by locking their mother out. That wasn't the way to make children feel safe, but it had at least provided a physical barrier to keep both of their parents away from them. They started using their keys to lock the rooms when they went out, too, after their mother had got horribly drunk one day and ripped all the posters off Eden's walls and torn them to shreds in a fit of rage. The locks allowed them to ignore the knocking and the ranting of their mother when her demands to be let in went unanswered. Instead, they'd stay silent and hope she might believe they'd gone out. It was why Eden had come up with their secret knock, the code that meant they'd know who was at the door. It was silly all these years down the line, with their mother and father both completely transformed from the people they'd been, but the secret knock endured all the same. Felix opened the door a few inches. "I don't interact with cold callers." His attempt at keeping his tone serious and his expression neutral failed almost instantly, and he laughed as she rolled her eyes. You've got 3 freezing callers out here, never mind cold ones, so just let us in, will you? You should have said Teddy was here. His heart instantly lifted at the sight of his 4-year-old nephew in the arms of Eden's partner, Drew. When Teddy reached out towards Felix, everything in the world was good again. Eden's little boy had been diagnosed with autism and, until very recently, had been completely non-verbal. Now he was beginning to say things, but the development of his speech was quite different to that of most children who would learn individual words and eventually begin to string them together. Teddy had what was called Gestalt language processing, and as soon as he started to speak, it was in phrases rather than individual words. The phrases had a unique meaning to Teddy and weren't always easily decipherable to those who didn't know him. One of the earliest examples had been when he'd memorized the phrase, "We all fall down," from the Ring-a-Ring-a-Roses nursery rhyme. Now, every time Teddy hurt himself, whether it involved falling over or not, he'd say, "We all fall down." The speech and language therapist had told Eden that the phrases were stepping stones to the development of more fluid speech, where the set phrases would eventually progress to single words. But she'd been so delighted for him to say anything at all that she wouldn't have minded what his first words had been. "Twinkle, twinkle." Teddy repeated the phrase with the same rhythm it had in the nursery rhyme. But Felix knew exactly what his nephew wanted, and it wasn't a sing-along. "Okay, sweetheart, let's get inside and I'll get your toy box out for you." Lifting Teddy into his arms, Felix carried him through to the larger open-plan living area, one corner of which had been given over to sensory equipment for his nephew. There was a big wooden toy box containing all the toys that Felix had bought for him. The most recent additions were a set of shatterproof tubes that were filled with liquid and glitter that twirled and danced when they were turned over or shaken. There were also some squidgy toys in different shapes, filled with sequins.